Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are on day 117 of the war with Hamas. It started on the 7th of October with the infiltration of thousands of terrorists and the massacre of 1,200 people, raped, butchered, tortured, burned alive, really quite despicable things, and another 240 people taken hostage. Of them, 136 still remain in Gaza. Israel launched its war of defense against the terrorists immediately after that, and that war has been continuing on over the last 117 days. We've destroyed much of the Hamas terror infrastructure in the northern Gaza Strip. Now IDF forces are working and operating in the central Gaza Strip, Nuseirat, Khan Yunis, and that area. And before we move on eventually to the southern Gaza Strip, to Rafah. During that period of time, IDF forces have killed and injured over half of the Hamas terrorists. So said Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant just yesterday. Over 9,000 terrorists have already been killed. That is a conservative estimate. The number of terrorists killed is unclear entirely, but at least 9,000 have been killed and many others have been already injured. The IDF forces have been operating to destroy all of the infrastructure. It means rocket launchers placed in every type of civilian and urban environment that you can imagine, under schools, in mosques, in clubhouses, and including UN installations. And that's what we're going to discuss a little bit later. UNRWA, the UN organization devoted entirely to serve the Palestine refugees. They, as it turns out, have been an integral part in Hamas's strategy and Hamas's terror. Now, just 2 days ago, we saw a number of long-range rockets being fired by Hamas, still have that capability, towards Tel Aviv, those rocket launchers being immediately destroyed thereafter. It would appear that IDF forces were closing in on the site, and the terrorists chose to, instead of just allowing the soldiers to capture the rockets, to shoot them before they could be destroyed. That's something that we've seen all the way through and is continuing on. Rocket fire, mortar fire. Food, they say, in Gaza is running out, unless you believe the videos coming out of Khan Yunis showing dozens of Gazans going into a shawarma shop to eat their daily lunch. So they say food is running out, water is running out, rockets don't appear to be running out, neither do the terrorists. As part of that terror infrastructure, hundreds of kilometers, 1.5 times the size of the London Underground tunnels in Gaza Strip. Many of them have already been destroyed. Hamas spent hundreds of millions of dollars building those tunnels, digging those tunnels, really amazing engineering feats, 20 meters deep into the ground on a coastal region adjacent to the sea. Really quite a feat to dig such extensive tunnels, and Hamas did that with equipment obviously smuggled in from Egypt. In the north, the war with Hezbollah continues on. Rockets being fired again today by Hezbollah towards Israel's north. There we still, just to remind everyone, have 100,000 people who have been evacuated from their homes, living in suitcases, refugees in their own country. Everyone talks about the Palestinians and their difficult times. What about the Israelis? We have about 200,000 Israelis living in suitcases, moving around, living in hotels, incapable of returning to their homes, whether it be in the southern area and the envelope around Gaza, or from the north. This is the untold story of those refugees as well. Israel obviously has been responding to Hezbollah with over 165 of their terrorists having already been killed. There was some discussion earlier in the month that Israel was setting the end of January as a deadline for really trying to make sure that any type of political solution that could be implemented would already be adopted. Hezbollah saw the deadline, knew about the deadline, and have obviously chose to ignore it. So we could see things potentially heating up on that northern border as well, and very soon. From the south, the Houthis are continuing on with their aggression against all types of vessels floating and through the sea and passing through Bab el-Manda, through the Horn of Africa, up towards the Red Sea. For now, it appears that they have not yet heeded the call of Egypt to only attack Israeli vessels. So said our friends and peace partners, Egypt, to the Houthis just a few days ago. In Judea and Samaria, the anti-terror activities have continued on. Many of you may have already seen the activities of the IDF Special Forces and the Israeli Special Forces acting in a hospital in Jenin, where terrorists who were planning an imminent terror attack were hiding out. 3 terrorists, 1 from Hamas, 2 from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all eliminated by the Israeli Special Forces. In Israel, thank God, everything has remained relatively quiet, and we've seen no more terrorist incidents as we saw just a few days ago. Now, on that note, what we're going to discuss today is UNRWA. UNRWA is this UN organization that's been around for the last 75 years. It was created initially as a temporary organization to deal with the Palestine refugees. That should not be confused with the term the Palestinian refugees. The Palestine refugees at the time included not only Arabs, but also Jews. The numbers given at the time were 700, these are numbers taken from UN reports in 1950 and 1951, 726,000 refugees. Of them, 711,000 were Arabs and 15,000 were Jews. The Jews have immediately fallen off the chart there. And so far, and for the rest of the 75 years, UNRWA has dealt exclusively with the Arab Palestine refugees. This organization has adopted a almost unique definition of a refugee, allowing that status to be passed down, handed down from generation to generation to generation. And so of the original 711,000 refugees, instead of any of those people being resettled, there are now over 6 million refugees, according to UNRWA. According to the UNRWA population dashboard launched just 2 years ago, being a Palestine refugee is apparently one of those what's called a segula, a kamea, for longevity. Whilst this region has been fraught with wars in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, civil wars, other wars, and obviously these refugees haven't been living in necessarily the best of circumstances. Nonetheless, according to UNRWA, over 60% of the original refugees are still alive. An incredible figure. US law requires that before any money is allocated to UNRWA by the US, the Secretary of State needs to certify that UNRWA is implementing a number of different steps. One of them is to ensure that UNRWA isn't teaching hate and inciting violence. UNRWA can't meet that standard and could never meet that standard as regards its teachers and its education system in the Gaza Strip, and yet the money continued to flow. One of the other requirements of US law is that the Secretary of State be able to certify that none of the US funds is going to terrorists. Unfortunately, it would appear that US Secretary of State has been misled by UNRWA over all of these years. Just yesterday, Elon Levy, the Israeli government spokesman, in a briefing devoted entirely to UNRWA, said that intelligence indicates that at least 13 UNRWA employees were actively involved in the October 7 massacre. Some of them actually infiltrated Israel and were involved in murdering Jews. Others I say just in inverted commas, were responsible for holding the hostages taken into Gaza, an UNRWA teacher holding hostages in his attic. Elon Levy added that Israeli intelligence indicates that 10% of the 12,000 UNRWA employees in Gaza, that means 1,200 people, are active members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Given these revelations, over over a dozen countries have already halted, suspended their contributions to UNRWA. America being one, UK being another, Canada, and a host of European countries. Now, this is what really we're going to discuss today. One of the biggest funders of UNRWA over the years has been the European countries, the European Union. And today we're joined by my friend Andrew Tucker. Andrew, as many of you will possibly already know and recognize his name, Andrew is the director of the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, think, an author, together with others, of a book called Two States for Two Peoples, really setting out the basis for Israel's claims to this area, and really the fundamentals of what you need to know from a legal perspective also, as to what to expect and what to think about and what to talk about when you're discussing Israel and the Palestinian relations. Andrew, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Maurice, thank you so much.
Let's get straight into it with your permission, Andrew, after that lengthy introduction. Give us a little bit of idea of the EU approach to UNRWA. How are they still funding this organization? Obviously, it's impossible, unreasonable to argue that the 13 employees who were actively involved in the massacre, or the other 1,200 employees of UNRWA, were only recruited in the last year, in the last year and a half. Really, everybody knows and has known for a long time that UNRWA is fundamentally compromised. UNRWA, at least in the Gaza Strip, is dominated by Hamas, as Elon Levy said yesterday. How does the EU and the European countries justify funding this organization? Just as a final word on that, UNRWA's whole goal in life, its raison d'etre, is to perpetuate this idea that these Arab Palestinian refugees will one day return to Israel, somewhere where most of them have never ever been, and will flood and destroy Israel democratically and demographically. How does Europe justify perpetuating that lie, helping UNRWA, Hamas attack Israel?
Well, thank you, Maurice. I thought what I might do, with your permission, is I have a few slides I can share just to put this into context of the Europeans' approach to not only the Gaza Strip, but to the Palestinians and the Palestinian territories generally. So would that be appropriate if I just share those slides?
That would be excellent. You should already be able to share your screen.
Okay, so let me do that. And with a bit of luck, we will be able to do that. And I will go back to the beginning of my slides here. Okay, so hopefully now you can see that.
There we go. And I plugged your book even before you put it up.
I know, this is amazing. I think we must be two brilliant minds thinking alike, that's for sure. So the topic
is here. I'm not sure about mine.
Can and should UNRWA be supported, defunded or dismantled? European developments and perspectives. So let's go back just a little bit. Now let's see, how do I do this? Why is it not working? Okay. I think we need to go back to understand the European perspective on this, right back to the Yom Kippur War of 1973. So after the Yom Kippur War, the Europeans basically developed an understanding with the Arab world, which was known as the Euro-Arab dialogue. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is proven through documentation. It wasn't a treaty, but it was an understanding supported by an organization and finances to collaborate together with the Arab world. And basically the deal was that Europe would open its doors to Arab Islamic immigration. Europe would offer the Arab world access to European immigration, but also culture. And Europe would begin to purchase increasing amounts of oil from the Arab world. Okay, so we're talking about the Arab oil boycott after the Yom Kippur War, which we all know well about. I'm based in the Netherlands. Netherlands was one of those countries that was being boycotted by the Arab world. And Europe was in a difficult place. It desperately needed access to oil. This is prior to the opening up of Russian, Eastern European oil and gas supplies. So part of the deal was as well that the Europeans would support the Palestinians. Okay, we weren't talking about statehood at that point, but we're talking about the agreement to support Palestinian right to self-determination, which developed into the EU two-states policy over the succeeding decade. So by 1980, this had been formalized into the Venice Declaration, in which the Europeans said, we now support the right of the Palestinians to a state in all of the occupied territories. So I think it's important to understand.
In other words, terrorism works. The war started in 1973 by the Arab countries, led to the embargo, and basically Europe gave in.
This is the lesson which I think we're learning. We failed to learn even till today, that terror does work, and we keep giving into it. And by giving in every time, we simply perpetuate the same problem. So from 1980, the Europeans decided that, and this was really their endeavor to counter the US. Europe wanted to play a role in the Middle East peace process. They saw the United States as being the main protagonist in this. And the only way for Europe to play a role of any significance would be through money, financing the Palestinians. So that was the approach. And they did it through really 5 mechanisms. Financial support to the Palestinian Authority. It's one we'll talk about. Secondly, building Palestinian security institutions. Thirdly, assisting the Palestinians to build in Area C after the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. So we still see Europe funding illegal Palestinian infrastructure in Area C. A 4th pillar was UNRWA, and the 5th is the payment to pro-Palestinian NGOs, right? And it's all about finances. Since 2000, the Europeans have paid, on average, over $1 billion per annum, okay, through all these mechanisms. And I'm talking about the European Union and its member states. So some of the money comes from Brussels, some of it goes directly from the capitals, Berlin, Paris, particularly, but also some of the smaller EU member states. Together, the European Union and the member states are the largest financial sponsor of the Palestinians. It's very important that the Europeans are the Palestinians' lifeline. Without Europe, the Palestinian Authority would be bankrupt. Well, it is bankrupt already, but it would simply be non-existent. And the Europeans finance over half of all foreign aid to the Palestinians. So as I say, PA is totally dependent on foreign aid, particularly European aid. There are 2 main problems: lack of transparency and a complete lack of accountability. This has been one of the big problems. And I think, as somebody said recently, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg in this UNRWA situation. There's so much corruption and mismanagement of funds. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we're trying to get to the bottom of Dutch funding of pro-Palestinian NGOs supporting Hamas, supporting Palestinian, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, and for other pro-Palestinian entities, which, by the way, are all undermining European policy, which is a 2-states policy. And of course, as we know, Hamas and the Palestinian jihadic movements are not in favor of a 2-state policy, but of a 1-state policy. They want to see a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. So you could say European funding, even of UNRWA, is undermining Europe's own policy of creating an independent, democratic, sovereign, peace-loving Palestinian state. So that's the background, I think, to UNRWA. And as you've said, we've seen since last Friday, I want to just mention there, by the way, Maurice, 26th of January last week was the same day that the International Court of Justice issued its ruling and preliminary measures in the South African genocide case. And the court relied largely on evidence provided by UNRWA. I think you talked about that yesterday with Natasha. And it's incredible, isn't it, that that's the very day that all of this came up and we all realized actually UNRWA is infiltrated by Hamas. So how can we trust the so-called objective position of the UNRWA leadership, which was the basis on which the court decided that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide of the Palestinians? So this whole UNRWA thing feeds into the international institutions as well. All of which to say, I think as Europeans, we bear a lot of responsibility for this catastrophe, and therefore for also what we're seeing in the International Court of Justice. So since Friday, we've seen 16 nations besides the US withdrawing or deciding to freeze or pause their funding of UNRWA, including the European Union. So I thought just a couple of minutes to get a bit of an overview of funding of UNRWA. The budget of UNRWA fluctuates, but let's say more or less on average about $1 billion a year. I think that's more or less about right.
I think in the last years it's even been over that. I think it's been like 1.2 and 1.3 billion. Right.
And of course, UNRWA operating in lots of different locations, from Lebanon to Jordan to the Palestinian territories, including the Gaza Strip. So this problem is bigger than Gaza, obviously. This is a massive problem which goes to the whole edifice, I think, of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, so-called. But just to give you an idea, the Europeans are a key funder of UNRWA. And in many years, up to, or perhaps even exceeding 50% of the budget of UNRWA is coming from Europe. So that's important, I think, to understand, and also to bear in mind, of course, that its budget of UNRWA is largely, in the majority, provided by Western countries, isn't it? Where are the Arabs in all of this? Why are the Arab states failing to support the Palestinians? We in the West have supported for decades now, as you said, this fiction that the Palestinians have a right to return, and Europe has been the main one in that. 2023, for some reason, you might explain that I don't understand why the UNRWA budget last year was much less than previous years. As my understanding is it was less than $500 million, of which the largest, or amongst the largest, are the United States and many European countries. These are the
23 figures
annual.
Were broken into the different periods, and it's not the full year. The money is passed through the year. So often there is an update as to exactly what their budget was after the end of the year, instead of that's just following the pledges that were there along the way.
Right. Okay. So this slide just gives you a bit of an understanding over the last 6 years anyway, what the kind of amounts of money are that we're talking about. And we're talking here of the total UNRWA budget, not just the Gaza Strip, obviously.
That means just in the last 7 years, $7.5 billion, 0 refugees settled. Rather, the refugee population grew by some 100,000 people.
That's the core message, isn't it, Maurice? It's not a refugee program at all. It's a program it's a political program, isn't it, to support the idea that the Palestinians will have a right to return not just to a possible Palestinian state, but to all of Palestine, including the state of Israel. So there is an agenda here, isn't there, that we have been supporting. I'm going to slip through these slides there just to give you an impression of the numbers. And you'll see again all the European member states, many of them in any event contributing. And I think since last week we've seen a kind of panic. Everybody knew this, as you said before. Everybody knew already there was a problem, but this is now just becoming concrete. So we're seeing a kind of panic reaction. Again, the top 20 donors to UNRWA, United States and the European Commission or the European Union being amongst the top ones. Okay, I won't go into more detail about this. So the question now is, what happens now? We've seen 16 states, as I say, of which 10 European member states have decided to freeze or pause their funding. They've been very unclear about what that means. The UNRWA has agreed to a kind of investigation of some sort, a UN-led investigation. Well, none of us really knows what that will be.
Well, but we know already to say that it will be a whitewash and a disgrace. These people knew that these were Hamas employees on their payroll, Hamas members on their payroll, and now they're giving them the opportunity to clear themselves of any misdoing. It really is that basic suggestion is offensive.
Right, right. Well, fortunately, I think the European Commission has decided also to temporarily.
What I particularly liked in that previous slide, Andrew, was the statement of Lazzarini that any UNRWA employee who was involved in acts of terror will be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution. As a long levy quite clearly asked, well, who exactly are they talking about prosecuting them? Is UNRWA going to hand these people over to the Hamas authorities in Gaza? Will they be the ones prosecuting them? An absolute joke. I don't think Lazzarini really expects us to take either him or his organization seriously when he makes really ridiculous claims like that.
Right. So I think this will be the big battle, won't it? Is whether or not sufficient pressure can be put on the UN to make sure that this is a credible kind of investigation. And we've always seen this habit of the European countries not taking responsibility for ensuring the accountability of the funds that they're providing. So they hand everything over to the UN. And the question now is whether the European Commission and the member states will have the courage and have the determination to insist that they are involved in the investigation. And it's even hard to put a lot of confidence in the European Commission. The Commission has been also, I think, a failure in insisting on accountability over the many, many years. We've seen a lot of attempts in the European institutions to require the Commission to ensure that funds are not put into the Palestinian school books, into the whole Palestinian UNRWA education system, which is inciting terror, inciting hatred. And the Commission has been terribly slow in moving any of this forward. So it will come down to, I think, pressure in the member states, pressure in the capital cities. We come back to, I think, mobilizing and equipping parliaments in European countries to pressure the governments in Europe, to pressure the European Commission. It'll be a slow process, but I can see even here in the Netherlands where we're situated, and it's certainly happening in Germany and I think France to some extent as well. People are fed up. They've seen that this is not working. And they want to pressure their own governments to make sure that this is not perpetuated. Okay. So these are the countries that have suspended funding for the time being: United States, Germany, European Union, Sweden, Japan, interestingly, which is a big funder of UNRWA, France, Switzerland, Canada, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Australia, which is an interesting one, by the way. Australian government is not particularly pro-Israel government. It's a very left-wing government, very pro-Palestinian, but they've realized that something is fundamentally wrong here as well, and that's a good sign. Italy, Austria, Finland, New Zealand, Iceland, Romania, Estonia, and there will be more, I think, in the coming days as well. This is the European Commission statement of 2 days ago, saying the European Union is one of the largest donors of humanitarian and development aid to the Palestinians. Humanitarian aid will continue. This is an issue, I think, to go forward. Obviously, the big problem with Gaza is humanitarian aid, isn't it? And UNRWA is not the right vehicle for distributing humanitarian aid because it's
Really, that's the question with the humanitarian aid. And the claim that there is no alternative to UNRWA. UNRWA has the widest logistical spread and the largest logistical capabilities. And really, what that is fundamentally based on is the fact that many of the capabilities are Hamas capabilities, and so it's not UNRWA that's handing out the aid, but rather Hamas that's handing out the aid. For those of you who didn't see just yesterday or 2 days ago, a picture that was published of Hamas terrorists standing above a UN truck with the aid from the UK going into an UNRWA logistical site. UNRWA really is functioning based on the whims of Hamas, and really it is no longer fulfilling its function as an independent, neutral organization. It is a front for a terror organization, and therefore there must be an alternative to their activities.
Well, interesting. It's a Dutch diplomat who is now leading the UN endeavor to rebuild Gaza, Sigrid Kaag.
Do you have any confidence in her, Andrew? This was the same minister who knew about the Dutch funding to the PFLP organizations and hid it, covered it up until she was finally forced and embarrassed into admitting it, and who has already tweeted out that she sees no alternative to UNRWA, even given the very serious allegations against the organization and the clear involvement of terrorists embedded in the organization.
I agree. It's problematic. I think she's a very capable administrator, but her perspective is very much a UN perspective. She believes in the institutions. Although I do suspect she also knows that there is a problem here, and I think she will realize there has to be some kind of reform. The European Commission has said that they do want independent external experts appointed by the EU to be involved in this investigation, and we'll see what they come up with. So, apart from its UN UNRWA funding, the European Union has separate budgets for humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, so they're not subject to this freeze, as I understand it. But it's not clear exactly what the mechanism is for that humanitarian aid getting to the Palestinians in Gaza, and I think it's through UNRWA. So again, we come back to the same problem: is who is going to replace UNRWA to distribute the humanitarian aid?
And that really is in and of itself a little bit of an oxymoron about EU policy. When you consider funding an organization that actively calls for the murder of Jews, for the destruction of Israel, and then also pays financial incentives for those who are involved in terrorism, including those who murdered Jews, including the participants in the October 7 massacre. And that's not even talking about Hamas. That's talking about the Palestinian Authority. They're the good guys that the EU wants to keep on funding.
Well, that's the bottom line, isn't it? And that's a good point, I think, to finish my presentation, because I think at the end of the day, this is the fundamental problem. It's not about UNRWA as such. It's about the whole system of creating an independent Palestinian entity, which I think we have to conclude, Maurice, has been a failure. And we have to review this whole question of whether the Palestinians are able to build an independent, peace-loving society, because without that, you will never have Palestinian statehood, and therefore no peace agreement, no solution to the Oslo process. It's time to go back to square one.
UNRWA really has just to give our audience a bit of an understanding, UNRWA has perpetuated this idea of Palestinian refugeehood, not the idea of settling them. Millions and millions of refugees have been created and settled over the last 75 years. None of these situations have caused an exponential growth of the number of refugees from any country. And really, UNRWA has been, to a great extent, misleading the world for many, many years. UNRWA claims, for example, in Lebanon, that there are over 450,000 refugees, when really studies have shown for many years that the number is maybe only a third of that. UNRWA never takes off people who have received foreign citizenship. So you have people like Mohammed Khadid in America, a property developer worth $5 million. He's a registered UNRWA refugee, which is just outrageous. He has foreign citizenship. In no other refugee situation do you continue to hold that refugee status once you've already received foreign citizenship. And so UNRWA really has been saying, well, we have 6 million, over 6 million people. Really, the truth is much lower than that. Of those, like I said, UNRWA claims that over 300,000 of the original refugees are still alive. If we remember the reports put out by the Trump administration, who estimated that there are no more than about 30,000 of those original refugees who are still alive, which would make sense. These are people who would be all 75, 76 years plus from that original group. In those studies from the UN that I referred to in the introduction, there are actually breakdowns of the age groups of the refugees, and that would seem to suggest that only 5% of the original refugees were under the age, or 15% of the original refugees were under the age of 15. So really, we're talking about people who now must be anywhere between 75 and, according to UNRWA, 95, 100. And all those people are still being catered to and provided for and funded. In some of the crazy things that you see is that if you have two people living next door each other in Jenin, Samaria, let's take Jenin, for example, you have a member or resident of the refugee camp and a resident of the town itself. Each one lives under the Palestinian Authority. Each one pays taxes to the Palestinian Authority. Each one is counted as a member of this group that the Palestinian Authority says is under their control. One is a refugee, and when he's sick, goes to an UNRWA surgeon, an UNRWA doctor. The other one goes to a Palestinian Authority doctor. Why would that be the case? One goes to an UNRWA school funded by the international community. The other goes to a Palestinian Authority school, which is also funded by the international community. Let's make that clear. But that disparity of two people living next door each other in the same circumstances whatsoever, in the areas that are administered by the Palestinian Authority, absolutely nothing to do with each other. And that's some of the absurds that have been created. Just going back to Lebanon for a few minutes, where these Palestinian refugees, these Palestine refugees have been banned, prohibited from engaging in dozens, scores of professions, prohibited from owning land. Really, if you're talking about apartheid in the Middle East, it is in Lebanon against these Palestine refugees. Jordan, that seems to have given them some type of citizenship until it revoked the citizenship for some of them. Really, these people have been used as pawns for the last 75 years against Israel to their detriment. And this is what UNRWA has done. This is an organization which, even if it had some type of initial justification, hasn't had any justification to exist for at least 30 years, if not more than that, and is fundamentally corrupt. So I think it's amazing that you start this presentation with that linkage of the European support for this whole endeavor to the 1973 oil embargo. That understanding that really that terrorism works. You can start a war, you can attack Israel, October 7 and October 7, 50 years later. Really, that's the same thing that you saw. And now we're seeing that same idea of using terrorism for political gain, using the October 7 massacres to promote this idea of, well, now we must have a two-state solution. Well, why?
Well, that's to be honest with one of my concerns about this International Court of Justice ruling as well, which just shows signs of that same reasoning. The court should have thrown this whole thing out, right? As the Ugandan judge so adequately put it, and I think the Israeli judge Barak as well. The idea that Israel is committing genocide and not Hamas is totally absurd. But the court kind of just gives in to this idea that, well, you know, Hamas is responding to 70 years of occupation, and they have a right to, although the court didn't say it in this way, but it's also using international law to give in to undermine the right of a sovereign state like Israel to use proportionate use of force in self-defense to defeat terror. And terror, by definition, is a fundamental breach of every principle of international law. So we've got to,
in Europe, really would be pretty, excuse my language, pretty pissed if Israel was to support the Catalonians and dividing Belgium into the Flemish and the French speakers, and really taking every type of intersocietal battle and turning it into really this uprising against the country. And here you have Europe supporting the idea of destroying, really destroying Israel, whether it be through violence or demographics. And that seems to be reasonable to them. How do they get to that conclusion, Andrew?
Look, that's the eternal question. And that's kind of the question we tried to grapple with in our book as well. What actually happened? And I think it is a kind of, you know, the Europeans in the 1960s, 70s, they were weak. They were recovering from the Second World War. They were internationally without any significance. And they were desperate to recover their sense of pride, their sense of purpose. And the way to do it was to embark on this project of supporting the Palestinians. This would be their contribution to, I think it's a kind of arrogance, a kind of inverted sense of, you know, we are important and we can tell, and this is the message that they keep saying, you know, we Europeans know what it is to create peace because we've done it. So we can tell you, Israel, how to do it as well. And I think this is fundamentally flawed, and Europe needs to take a step back and say, well, we haven't been able to solve this problem. The only way is through empowering the parties on the ground to reach their own resolution.
and that's something which I think is almost impossible to really reach. One of the fundamental aspects also left as part of the final status negotiations in the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian Authority is the idea of the refugees. Now, what do you do with these people? How do you deal with them? What's going to happen to them? From Mahmoud Abbas has said repeatedly, not he or any other Palestinian leader has the right to waive any of, or has the jurisdiction to waive the rights of the refugees. That means in their point of view, every single one of these people must return. And they're really, I can't fault necessarily to the greatest extent Mahmoud Abbas. What can you expect him to say if the Europeans and the UN and even the US are supporting UNRWA and supporting this whole idea of the return of the refugees and with both political support and financial support? How would Mahmoud Abbas even be able to say anything else? If you remember in 2013, Andrew, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu even suggested that some of the Palestine refugees living in Syria under the civil war being gassed by Assad would be allowed to come back and would be allowed to come and settle in Judea and Samaria. The only condition was that they give up on their refugee status. Mahmoud Abbas's answer was absolutely not. He preferred that these people die at the hands of Bashar Assad, be gassed to death, rather than giving up on what he defined as their sacred right. So how can we ever get anywhere with that? If the world is supporting the UNRWA on the one hand, how can we ever expect a Palestinian leader to be more flexible than the rest of the world? I think it's almost an unreasonable expectation.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the Oslo Accords were really also largely a result of European Western pressure on Israel the Oslo Accords are a kind of compromise, aren't they? I think at the end of the day, you go back to a very basic question about the status of the territories too, don't you? And where and how are secure borders of Israel ever going to be determined? And Israel took the position after 1967 to treat, as I understand it, to treat the territories occupied because they were concerned about international pressure. So this whole idea of occupation undermining Israeli sovereignty. So Europe took the view that all of the territories outside the Green Line belongs to the Palestinians. That's really the European position. They've taken a position on sovereignty, which is obviously not supported by international law, but it's also partly a result of the fact that Israel is also not taking a strong position, and never has, on the sovereignty claims to the territories. So I think in a way these issues are very much connected, and we'll see it in Gaza as well, right? Who does Gaza belong to post-conflict? Does Israel have any right to keep control, and if so, on what basis?
Well, on that subject, I know to tell you that the Palestinian Authority should have no role whatsoever to play in the future of the Gaza Strip. Neither should UNRWA, neither should any of these UN organizations that perpetuate the same lie, the same myth that Israel will eventually be demographically and democratically and destroyed. Unfortunately, Andrew, as we're coming to the end of our time, I just want to throw in there one last idea before I ask you to maybe give a concluding note. After Israel's War of Independence, the UN appointed a trilateral committee to try and negotiate an agreement between the nation state, the nation Jewish state, and its neighbors. As part of that, part of those discussions, documented amazingly in a UN document. Really, you can't make this up because it's so well documented, but it's so much unknown. As part of those negotiations, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister at the time, made the following suggestion. The Arab countries should recognize Israel within the armistice lines, i.e., even giving up on Judea and Samaria, but that Gaza should be included in the Jewish state. And Israel would give equal citizenship to all of those people. Now, imagine, obviously, that suggestion was rejected by the Arab states. The international community supported those Arab states in their rejection. Imagine what a difference we would have seen had Gaza been part of Israel and the people there given equal citizenship. Imagine how many lives we would have been able to save on both sides of the populations, had there not been that intransience. I wrote about this recently, really in an article that I published, asking, well, why does the world hate the Gazans? Really, a series of decisions against the Gazans by the international community, including the fact that from this recent war, there are 0 refugees. That doesn't happen in a war. There are always refugees, specifically in an area that is small and heavily populated with intensive fighting. There will always be refugees, but not here. The international community has said, no, we're not going to open the doors. We're not going to force Egypt to open the doors. None of us are willing to take any of these people. They will remain leverage against Israel. That's unfortunately the situation. Where do we go from here with Europe and UNRWA, Andrew, as a closing remark? How do we go forward?
Look, good question. I think we need to, first of all, take a fundamental view to all of this. So we need to look at the whole thing, not just UNRWA, not just this very specific issue which has come up, but the whole structure, and re-evaluate the whole approach to Palestinian statehood. To my mind, that is the issue that that Europe needs to grapple with. Because that's still Europe's position. Now, if Europe is continuing to support a Palestinian state, what is this state going to look like? Why are we allowing the creation of a state which will have Islamist jihad as its core central value that will drive it? Which is incredible when you think about it. Europe, that is itself being subject to terror, is now seeking to impose such a state on the state of Israel. So we will be arguing, and I think as many as possible other people arguing for a fundamental reevaluation of Europe's approach. And at the end of the day, one of the issues is, what do we do with the Islamist jihad agenda? Because it's the same issue in Europe in many ways. How do we tackle this issue, which is fundamentally anti-Western, anti-democratic, undermining everything that Europe stands for, let alone Israel? That is the question Europe has to ask itself also in relation to its support for the Palestinians.
Andrew, I think that's exactly right. If the international community wishes to see any type of peace between Israel and the Palestinians and its neighbors, there are a certain really fundamentals that they've built up over many years that need to be brought down. One of them is this whole idea of UNRWA and the Palestine refugees. It's time the international community accepted, and the Palestinians as well, that Israel will never agree to commit national suicide by allowing millions of so-called Palestinians back into Palestinian refugees into Israel where they've never been, and that will never happen. And so you have to find another solution from this a program where the number of refugees just grows and grows and grows and grows, really eternally, and it's simply not workable.
No, and I think just to jump in there, Ross, I think this is going to be an international problem. The Arab states have to be involved in this. I don't see any solution without Egypt being involved, Jordan particularly.
Egypt, I'm not sure, needs to be involved. There are no Palestine refugees in Egypt. Egypt refused, even since 48, has closed the doors on these people. They were willing to fight everyone else, but that idea of Arab brotherhood stopped at the Egyptian border already a very long time ago. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan have to be part of this discussion. This idea of holding these people in limbo forever. People who know no other country. They've grown up, they've lived in these countries for 75 years, excepting those that moved to America and already got citizenship, or to Europe. And therefore, they need to be part of this solution as well. This idea of perpetual refugee status is something that needs to be re-examined from its foundations, because as I said before, or at least I would like to argue, as long as the Europeans and the US hang on to this really fundamentally poisonous organization, there's no way to expect any Palestinian leader to make a different position, to take a different position. And so UNRWA is, not only because of its involvement in terrorism and its education program, a massive part of the problem. It is the problem. And that has to be the realization going forward. Just a few days ago, we sat here with member of Knesset Sharon Heskel at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, discussing this subject and her initiative also to bring about the dismantling of UNRWA. We hope to be able to continue on in those efforts, advising and helping to the best extent. Unfortunately, Andrea, our time has very, very quickly, at least for me, run out. And so I would like to thank you again for joining us. For those of you who are watching, you can follow and join us via the JCPA website. There's the link to the daily broadcast. You can also join and subscribe to our YouTube channel and join there as well. We will be back with you again tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock Israel time. In the meantime, thank you for being with us. I apologize that I didn't get to the questions today. I saw, Lisa Corson, that you had written a few questions. I apologize that we just didn't get to it. I will try and address them at a later stage. But in the meantime, to everyone around the world from wherever you're joining us, thank you, and keep